The year was 1484, and for the German people they had grown increasingly restless. It seemed for them they had been plagued with nothing but bad luck. Coupled with disease and crop failure, there was only one logical explanation: witchcraft. When Kramer asked for permission to set up a witch hunt within his home village, his request was denied. But he wasn't going to let this small mishap ruin his chances of a worldwide witch execution, so he sent a letter to the Pope detailing what he intended to do and asked him to set up a public decree that would allow the persecution and execution of witches. So when Kramer returned home a year later, he wasn't expected to be denied by the local authorities again, because the persecution of witchcraft was now legal and endorsed by the Pope. So it was to his surprise when they said no again. Kramer, angry and upset with the outcome, went off in his home and wrote a book called Malleus Maleficarum, which detailed the evils of witchcraft and built the foundation for the witch hunts to come. Not only that, it was the second best-selling book across all of Europe for the following 200 years, with number one being the Bible. Kramer got exactly what he wanted. However, throughout most of Europe it was still relatively rare to be accused of witchcraft. But this all changed in the 16th century. The Protestant Reformation had caught traction, meaning if you were Catholic, you believed that those who were Protestant were moving away from God and harbouring witches. And if you were Protestant, you thought that Catholics were wrong in their beliefs and therefore thought they were also harbouring witches. This increase in witch accusations meant that in 1542 Henry VIII was forced to publish the Witchcraft Act, establishing that anybody who used witchcraft to harm somebody or something would be sentenced to death. James I is probably the most infamous king regarding the witch craze, being the biggest factor in what caused it to spiral out of control in the first place. After visiting Denmark whilst on his honeymoon, he was introduced to a group of local wise men who spoke of sorcery, blaming witchcraft as the sole reason for the treacherous storms James had to endure upon his arrival. Although it's likely James didn't take much notice at the time, when he returned to Britain, he had succumbed to becoming a witch fanatic after being the centre of his very own witch trial. By the time James returned back from Denmark, a witch trial had been set in place, revolving around several witches in North Berwick, blamed for conjuring up a storm. One witch in particular, Agnes Sampson, caught the eye of James, and whilst interrogating her, she whispered in his ear, reciting the exact words James spoke to his wife on the first night of their marriage. James was now convinced witches lived among him, and he needed to do something about it. Obviously, it's quite unlikely that Agnes really recited the words James claimed she said, but it made sense for James to add that small little detail in his own publication outlining what happened. During the initial stages of the witch craze within Britain, it is clear that the country was as fascinated by the idea of witches as James was, including one unknown playwright who wrote a play based on the events that unfolded in North Berwick. That play, you might be asking, was called Macbeth. The playwright? William Shakespeare. Although the belief in witchcraft was growing, there was a few who grew sceptical, including a man by the name of Reginald Scott, coined for being the father of witchcraft skepticism, who in 1584 wrote a book called A Discovery of Witchcraft, which disputed many claims made by leading witch hunters, as well as claimed that witches did not wield magical powers, but instead were mentally ill and depressed. And you might think that this publication would have stopped the witch trials in Britain in its tracks, but you'd be wrong, mainly because King James ordered all copies to be burnt after hearing what Scott had written about, and responded with his very own publication entitled Daemonologie, which leading witch hunters would use as their Bible when prosecuting witches for the following century. During the time of the Berwick witches in Scotland, a young boy named Thomas Darling had accused a 60-year-old woman by the name of Alice Goodridge and her mother of bewitching him after he returned home with delusions and hallucinations, which worsened when passages of the Bible were read out to him. Goodridge and her mother were tortured whilst in prison, forcing them to confess, and within a few days they did exactly that, confessing to everything and anything that they were accused of. Now introduce John Darrell, an acclaimed exorcist who claims he can heal Thomas from his apparent bewitching, which fair dues to him because he did. But in 1599, Samuel Harsnet released his very own publication titled A Discovery of Fraudulent Practices of John Darrell. His work questioned the reliability of Darrell's supposed exorcisms, and Harsnet was able to extract a confession from Thomas Darling himself, confessing that the whole story was fabricated. During the early 17th century in Lancashire, John Law, a pedlar from Halifax, encountered a beggar called Alison Davis, who he claimed bewitched him after refusing to give her any money. After she cursed him, he became paralysed down one side and was unable to speak. Abraham Law, John's son, heard of his father's condition and went searching for the witch responsible, eventually finding Alison, who begged for forgiveness, which she was given by John. Abraham, however, didn't have the same attitude, and from what we can only imagine was spite, he reported her to the local magistrate, leading her to be imprisoned and tortured by the leading investigator, Roger Knoll, of which she confessed that her grandmother, Old Demdike, was also a witch, as well as the woman she had once quarrelled with, Old Chattox. During the trial, Alison Davis's family were all questioned after a suspicious meeting was held at Malkin Tower. Among those who attended was also the Chattox family, who were subsequently questioned. Old Demdike had died, but before she died she wrote a sworn statement claiming that Old Chattox, as well as her daughter, had used clay figures of people in hope to bewitch them, which were later discovered near the castle they were imprisoned in. During the trial of Old Chattox, this evidence was put forward, but her fate was sealed. The sworn testimony of another witch was enough to get Chattox a one-way ticket to the gallows. Her daughter was the next witch to stand trial, and like her mother, her fate was sealed. In front of the jury, Chattox made one last attempt to save her daughter's life and claimed to have made the clay figures herself, without her daughter's intervention, but to no avail. She, like her mother, was also sent to the gallows. Elizabeth Davis, the mother of Alison, Janet and James Davis, was put on trial. However, prior to this, leading investigators had prodded James and Janet in providing defamatory evidence against their mother, of which they did, willingly. So that when Elizabeth was brought into court, kicking and screaming, she cried angrily at Janet in hope for her to realise the extent of what she has done, pleading with the court to let her go. But she was unsuccessful. Janet, only 9 years old, stood on a table in the middle of the courtroom and openly accused her own mother of being a witch.
My mother is a witch, and that I know to be true. I have seen her spirit in the likeness of a brown dog, which she called Ball. The dog did ask what she would have him do, and she answered that she would have him help her to kill John Robinson of Barley, James Robinson, Henry Mitten.
This sworn statement was the nail in the coffin for Elizabeth, and she, like the Chattox family, would be executed. James Davis believed himself to be safe due to the immunity he was given by the investigators for providing evidence against his mother. But alas, the witch hunters thought otherwise. James pleaded not guilty, but the evidence presented against him by his own sister Janet persuaded the jury to find him guilty, resulting in his execution.
Because Janet turned on her own brother too.
Janet said that James had been a witch for 3 years. She had seen his spirit kill 3 people.
And lastly, the woman who started it all, Alison Davis, entered the courtroom. Standing there, she pleaded for forgiveness, but it was too late. When she was asked by John Law, the man who believed to have bewitched him, whether she could restore him back to health, she claimed the only person who could have was Old Demdike, who was now dead. Alison, along with her mother and brother, were found guilty and sentenced to death. All but one of the accused came out of the trial alive, young Janet Davis. However, a few decades later, Janet would wind up the centre of another witch hunt, except this time she was the witch being accused. Bamberg, Germany. The Protestant Reformation had begun to slow down throughout most of Europe as a result of a counter-Reformation movement within the Catholic Church opposing Church of England ideologies. This, similar to within the UK, created divisions and skepticism between both sides, with each side believing that the other were harbouring witches. However, this was just a spark that lit the flame. On the horizon was a war that would last 30 years. The town of Bamberg was left devastated during the war. Crop failures became a yearly occurrence, and high taxes left most of the population struggling with money due to the over-expenditure during the war, which only resulted in those heavily affected to blame their misfortune on the intervention of witchcraft. Under the instruction of Johann Georg von Donheim, who gave himself the name the Witch Bishop, made it his duty to tackle witches within Bamberg, hiring several people to assist him in his witch hunts. By the late 1620s, there was a real possibility that you could become rich becoming a witch hunter. The stereotype of witches being old and poor was instead the complete opposite in Bamberg, with witch hunters targeting specific high-ranking individuals in the hope to inherit their wealth after they were executed. This was because if you were successfully convicted of being a witch in Bamberg, their land then became yours. On top of that, in multiple cases, not only were you convicted if you were thought to be a witch, but your entire family could also be at risk of having the same fate by association. In 1628, George Hans's daughter and wife were both convicted of witchcraft and executed. After he petitioned pleading to the High Court for them to intervene in the cases, he was then suspected of witchcraft himself by the same witch hunters who accused his wife. While standing trial, his son and daughter-in-law tried to intervene, but they too were accused of witchcraft and executed. The witch hunter who convicted them then became the sole owner of all their land and properties. However, there was a silver lining. Skepticism grew rapidly during this period. Not only were people beginning to see growing complaints that those executed were in fact innocent, but for the first time, there was growing fear that anybody in Bamberg could be accused of witchcraft. The trial of Dorothea Flock caused outrage within Bamberg. Flock, coming from a well-off family, was arrested after her husband was accused of witchcraft. Although attempts were made by the family to express their concerns of the trial and for her unborn child, they were ignored by the emperor. After a few months, the family pleaded once again to stop the trials, and they were successful, resulting in a letter being sent from the emperor to von Donheim, ordering him to stop the witch trials. Von Donheim, hearing that a letter was on its way, conducted a private trial, preventing George Hans's daughter from having any lawyer and using only evidence used during torture. She was found guilty and executed of witchcraft. This caused a great deal of backlash, causing skepticism to reach its peak among people of Bamberg. However, despite the criticisms, as long as von Donheim was the Prince Bishop of Bamberg, the trials continued. Until 1630, when the Swedish army entered the 30-Year War, draining the remaining of Bamberg's resources, causing them to eventually give up. This surrender caused von Donheim to flee Bamberg out of the fear of being killed by the Swedish army. Within Bamberg, the population was now the lowest it had been in centuries, and high inflation meant that for the most part, the fight against witches was not a main priority. In 1625, James I died, leaving his eldest son Charles I to reign Britain.
My name is Charles II.
Who, after 20 years of being king, broke into a several decades long civil war, which in turn broke down traditional authority, meaning that individuals like the Witchfinder General, Matthew Hopkins, a title he gave himself, were able to freely accuse anybody of being a witch without the intervention of any authority figure. Chances are, if you have heard anything about the witch trials in the UK, you have heard of the infamous Matthew Hopkins, who, between the years 1644 and 1646, was the main cause behind 200 executions of witches. Charles I, unlike his father, was not as enthusiastic about witches as he was. Due to growing skepticism towards the witch craze at the time, and in an attempt to reduce the number of those falsely accused, he made it compulsory to provide evidence. And Hopkins did so willingly, using disingenuous tricks. It is believed that throughout his witch hunting career he carried a knife which, when pressed down, would retract into itself, giving the impression that if he pushed the knife into a supposed witch, they would not bleed. Undeniable proof that they were in fact a witch. When the Civil War broke out in 1642, Hopkins was able to bypass the standard way of persecuting witches through justices of the peace, who were typically uneducated and were voted in by the citizens of their jurisdiction. By creating mass hysteria among East Anglia, he was successfully able to prosecute every witch he accused. By the time 1646 rolled around, Anthony Hopkins' death count was nearing 200. So by the time he reached Cambridgeshire, a man by the name of John Gould, a vicar, had grew suspicious of his activities and began suppressing his witch hunts. Hopkins and his associate John Stern were both questioned about the legality of their witch hunts, including their use of torture in order to obtain confessions, as well as also questioning how Hopkins knew so much about witchcraft, insinuating to the court that it was possible that Hopkins himself could be a witch. The court session had halted but resumed a year later, of which Hopkins and Stern had both fled, retiring from witch hunting indefinitely. As a result of Hopkins no longer spreading hysteria and propaganda about witches, witch hunting within East Anglia declined dramatically. The year is 1656. Thomas Adey, an English physician, attacks the current ideas surrounding witchcraft, using direct quotes from the Bible to disprove witchfinders like Hopkins, who primarily used the Bible to validate their actions. In his skeptical publication A Candle in the Dark, he writes, "Where is it written in all the New and Old Testaments that a witch is a murderer or hath power to kill by witchcraft?" A few decades after Thomas Adey's initial publication, John Webster, an English physician and chemist, published his very own skeptical publication, titled The Displaying of Supposed Witchcraft, which denounced the existence of witches, discrediting a famous case called the Demon Drummer of Tedworth, which had occurred decades prior, explaining that the paranormal activity they experienced was not witchcraft, but instead could be explained through natural poisons and natural causes. One of the last influential skeptical publications published during the witch craze in Britain was written by Balthazar Bekker, titled The Enchanted World, writing, "Among all those I have cited, there is not a single example in which the chief circumstances are not incomplete. For the most part we are ignorant. There is thus no other magic that which is in the imagination of men. There are no phantoms, no divination, nor any obsessions which is from the devil." We now reach the end of the 17th century. During this time in history, the belief in witchcraft had steadily declined throughout most of Europe. Despite this, there was still one country in the world who had a solid belief in witchcraft, which would execute 20 witches over the next couple of years. Out of all the witch trials I've mentioned throughout this video, the one trial you've most likely heard of was the Salem witch trials. Those who lived in Salem were Puritan, a faction of Protestantism which sought to purify the world, making the world much more Puritan. Therefore, anything that wasn't Puritan was immediately thought of as unorthodox. For several decades, Salem, among the other British colonies, had been constantly attacked by Native Americans, resulting in several long-winded wars between them, leaving many feeling paranoid. During this time, the overseas British colonies were forced to pay a great deal of tax, which only resulted in suppressed outrage among the locals and a rise in poverty. These three factors is what resulted in the most infamous witch hunt in history. It's winter 1691. Elizabeth Parris and her cousin, Abigail Williams, have begun experimenting with fortune telling on occasion in hope to read the future. And on one occasion, whilst experimenting, one of the fortunes revealed a coffin. From that moment on, Elizabeth began barking like a dog. When prayers were read out to her, she would react negatively, screaming loudly. On inspection, it was confirmed by the local doctor that the girls were in fact possessed, but something needed to be done. Among Abigail and Elizabeth, there were several other young girls involved in providing evidence, including Anne Putnam, Mary Walcott, Mercy Lewis, and Elizabeth Hubbard. Introduce Tituba, a native Indian woman accused of witchcraft after she was asked to make a witch's cake, which did not deliver the expected results. She was arrested under suspicion of witchcraft and forced to confess in having a pact with the devil, as well as forcing her to give up any other witches she knew. One of the first witches to be named by Tituba was Sarah Good, a woman in her 40s who had made a few bad investments during her early life, resulting in her being homeless. When she was called to testify, among those who went against her was her own husband and daughter, proving, at least to the jury, that she was a witch. Another victim to fall prey to Tituba was Sarah Osborne, a promiscuous character living unmarried with an Irish servant, who was looked down upon by many of the inhabitants of Salem, which is likely why she was found guilty of witchcraft. Among those who were accused of witchcraft were Rebecca Nurse and Susanna Martin. Both elderly and well-respected ladies within the community were nonetheless both accused by the young girls of being witches. Despite both women claiming their innocence throughout the trial, the testimony made by the girls convinced the courtroom otherwise, resulting in their executions. They had only come to an end after Increase Mather and Governor William Phips discussed their joint skepticism of the trials, especially focusing on the lack of evidence used throughout the trials, resulting in the Court of Oyer and Terminer being closed down, as it being the main court responsible for the trials to take place to begin with, allowing those who had been incarcerated to be released. Unfortunately for Mather and Phips, they were too late to save those who had already been executed, but in 1693 Phips issued a general pardon, excusing those who had died throughout the trials. Between the mid-17th century and the early 18th century, there were very minimal witch hunts occurring throughout Europe. Despite this, a woman in Britain was convicted in 1712 of being a witch, being one of the last people to be condemned of witchcraft in England, and her name was Jane Wenham. After a farm labourer accused her of being a witch, she supposedly cursed at him, resulting in him putting wheat up his shirt and running around wailing. This accusation was made public and she reported him to the local GP, and as a result, the farmer was fined 1 shilling. Jane, displeased with the punishment he had been given, swore to get justice in another way, and as she had promised, the farmer's daughter fell ill along with his livestock. Angry and in need of justice himself, Jane was accused of witchcraft again, but this time he had 16 witnesses to provide evidence against her. Despite the entire village around her condemning her actions and lifestyle, when she was put in front of a judge, her case was dismissed almost instantly, and during the trial the accused stated that she had flown on a broomstick, of which the judge replied, "There is no law against flying." For many historians, this event marked the end of the witch craze in Britain, even though there were still a few people who believed. For the majority, they held it with great skepticism, although this doesn't mean that the rest of the world were just as equally as skeptical. In fact, there are still a few places across the world where witchcraft is a big belief in their culture. In areas of Europe like Denmark, the last witch trial took place in THISTED, almost a decade prior to the conviction of Jane Wenham. In January 1696, Miss Spelmond was diagnosed as having a demonic possession, and soon after, several other women in the town of THISTED began inhibiting similar symptoms. Those who were suspected of witchcraft were immediately charged and sent to the gallows. However, upon hearing these women would be executed, several of the women who claimed to have been possessed suddenly admitted to the court that they were lying, releasing those accused instantly and revoking the death sentence entirely for witchcraft. In Germany, the last witch to be accused of witchcraft was that of Anna Schwiegelen in 1775. Suspicions of Anna being a witch became public knowledge and she was arrested. Upon her arrest, she willingly confessed to making a pact with the devil and was found guilty. However, whilst awaiting to be executed, it would have seemed that her case was forgotten, resulting in her death 6 years later in her cell. The witch craze is certainly a dark time during our shared history. It is believed that there could have been up to 200,000 individuals falsely executed throughout all of Europe and America. Unfortunately, it's hard to exactly pinpoint how many people were truly affected, and it's entirely possible that we may never know. I hope you all enjoyed, and thanks for watching.
Now he looks at me like I'm a weirdo. He's looking at me like I'm bonkers. He's still looking at me. Pretty sure he is.